That's a pretty, that's a pretty amazing bird Sharon's got. Okay, that wasn't supposed to be on the recording, but here we go. Okay, I want to go back over some stuff uh, that, from some of the material that we handled last week. And I just want to stress that the problem for Naomi was not, when she's living in Moab and her husband dies, we're told after that her two sons get married to Moab women, Ruth and Orpah. Now, the problem was not that the women that the sons brought home were less than perfect. As Moabites, they were pagan worshippers of Chemosh, a god that demanded child sacrifice. So these women represented a believing Israelite mother's worst nightmares. The Moab nation, and this is going back some, but the Moab nation, according to the Hebrew Bible, descended from an incestuous encounter between Lot and his oldest daughter. So the Moabites were distant relatives from the shady side of Abraham's family tree. Mosaic law banned Moabites from assembly of Yahweh's people to the 10th generation. There are sordid chapters in Israel's past that resulted from romantic alliances with Moabite women. And all of this gives Naomi further cause for alarm, seeing, and I just want you to picture, we're not told this, but just imagine how Naomi feels when her sons marry these two Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. From the perspective of her culture, there were problems too. In ancient culture, and this is something, we look at this as the way things were long ago, but this, if you think about it, this kind of attitude is still with us in a lot of ways. Fathers typically negotiated arranged marriages, usually with an eye toward forging advantageous relationships with other families. The narrator of Ruth omits the details, but we already know that in addition to the drawbacks of their immigrant Israelite status and the absence of a father, Naomi and her sons were without land, wealth, or other assets that might attract a Moabite family's interest. Fathers in Moab's high society would not be inclined to marry off their daughters to the likes of Mahlon and Chilion. It's difficult to argue that the brides of Naomi's sons took for them, or the brides that they took for themselves were the cream of the crop, in other words, of young Moabite women. Things went from bad to worse. A decade passed, and neither Orpah nor Ruth conceived. And I talked about this last week. I just want to mention it again. If you calculate it from a woman's normal monthly cycle, Naomi and her daughters-in-law suffered as many as 240 separate and increasingly devastating disappointments in a culture where it was a woman's business to produce children. In addition to the heartache of this double barrenness, their inability to conceive was a catastrophe for the family. For the survival of Elimelech's line depended on the birth of at least one male to carry on the family name. And in the ancient world, of course, survival was everything. If you could imagine Naomi's prayers or her conversations with God as things went from bad to worse, you might think of Psalm 10, verse 1. Why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? This goes on for 10 years. And at the end of the 10 years, the premature deaths of both Naomi's sons, both of them die. We're not told how. This was the worst possible scenario for a widow. So the light had gone out in the Elimelech household. Annihilation was a fate the ancients feared the most. The deaths of Mahlon and Chilion Bereaved Naomi of her beloved children wiped out her life's work as a woman and brought the curtain down on the future. When they buried Naomi's sons, they were essentially burying Naomi too. Overnight, her already diminished social status hit rock bottom, and Naomi was suddenly at risk. Without a male connection, she has no place in society and no source of income. Without a male protector, she's fair game for the unscrupulous. Alone in a male-dominated world, Naomi was cast upon the mercy of a society that had little interest in her. But Naomi's social standing wasn't the only thing that was dropping. They're on their way now. Last week we reached the point where they were leaving Moab for Bethlehem because the problem with getting food had ended in Bethlehem. So they were going back there. And now as we start off in the middle of the road that runs between Moab and Bethlehem, Naomi stops to send her daughters-in-law back to Moab. What causes this scene to rock the entire book and what ranks it among the most dramatic moments of all biblical history, it's not what we might guess as being the tender display of Ruth's deep devotion to her mother-in-law, but the collision that takes place between the weight of evidence Naomi has mounted against God and the radical choice that Ruth makes. Naomi's decision to emancipate her daughters-in-law, the first rule-breaking event in this book, precipitates a crisis that forces both daughters-in-law to make what on the surface appears to be a pragmatic decision, but which, when examined more closely, reveals that matters of the greatest import are with us. The choices made on this historic spot will not only shape the souls of all three women, they will alter the course of Israel's history and advance the redemptive purposes of God. Naomi goes against cultural conventions and her own self-interest when she relinquishes two able-bodied young women who are duty-bound to her by marriage and whose departure will reduce her family to one. Given the circumstances, it is compassion on her part that leads her to do it. She's saying, she's saying, I'm going to be a millstone around your neck because I have lost God's favor. Don't be with me. You don't want that. She's a realist. She does not cherish the illusion that Bethlehem means a fresh start for her or for them. Naomi is postmenopausal. Her childbearing years have expired. She has no value as a wife. As potential brides, her daughters-in-law have two strikes against them, a long history of barrenness and their Moabite identity. In Bethlehem, they lack the necessary father figure to negotiate a marriage for them. Naomi cannot bring herself to drag them along with her into such a hopeless future. Their best chance for security is in returning to their roots. Now, we don't know this yet, but we do find out in chapter 2 that Ruth actually has a living father. She has a father and a mother. So she could go home to them. Their best chance of security, in Naomi's eyes, is to return to their roots. Now, it's interesting that they leave for Bethlehem and she chooses some spot along the road to make this announcement. And we don't know, and this is something that you as dramatists might decide, whether this is something she was thinking about all along or it's something that just occurs to her as they travel. Naomi has an ironclad determination to resume her journey without them. She's urging them to return to Moab, testing their loyalty, in a sense. What she really longs for them to stay with her, maybe, it's possible, she needs their protection, but she's making an unselfish choice. She means for them to go, and she formally releases both women from any legal, moral, or familial responsibility to her. She argues, coerces, implores, and all but hires a cab to take them back. Did she ever imagine that her task would be so hard? Naomi begins by simply instructing Orpah and Ruth to go back to Moab, adding her prayer that Yahweh will reward their kindness to her and to her sons by blessing them with rest in the homes of new husbands. Now, I will get into this later, but the word meaning rest actually means security, not relaxation. It means you'll be in a secure home. Her words are met with astonishing resistance. The countryside is filled with sobs as the trio weeps inconsolably, and the two young widows cling to Naomi. Naomi has underestimated the bonds of grief and love. Undeterred, Naomi tries again, this time spelling out in no uncertain terms the bitter fact that there is no future in Bethlehem. Even the normal provisions for young widows do not apply here, for Naomi has no surviving sons to marry the widows of Mahlon and Chilion. Bethlehem can only promise permanent widowhood for all three. Moab, on the other hand, perhaps offers hope. By verbalizing the awful truth about the death of her own hopes and the painful reality of her losses, it sinks in with renewed force. And as I pointed out last week, this is kind of a Job moment. Naomi is, in a sense, looking to God, saying, "Why have you abandoned me?" She can no longer stifle what her sufferings imply about God. The dam that for so long has been holding back a tidal wave of anger and despair bursts open in a flood of bitter hopelessness. No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me. Her arguments hit their mark with Orpah. She has seen and heard enough. Clearly, all signs for her point to Moab, and she will take her freedom and go home. After the three weep again, Orpah dries her eyes, says her goodbyes, and turns back, leaving Naomi and her clinging sister-in-law behind. Orpah submits to her mother-in-law's counsel. She is only following the logical trajectory of the evidence and doing what she has been told. She heads back to Moab with Naomi's full approval. Now, this is seen for Orpah as being a sensible thing rather than a selfish thing. At the same time, her actions create a striking contrast with the truly radical nature of Ruth's choice. After Orpah's departure, an emotionally depleted Naomi gathers strength to deal with her remaining daughter-in-law. Orpah's choice gives Naomi a new argument, a touch of peer pressure maybe, that she levels at Ruth. Pointing down the road, she argues, "Look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." And I want to point out at this point that at this time, there is a unity between God and the land and the country, the people, the nation, or the city, or the whatever the community is. That when you're living in Moab, you're living under Moabite gods, and to go back to Bethlehem, you're living under the God of Israel. So in a sense, the road itself determines which God you are going to worship. Something takes hold of Ruth that is bigger than both of them. And I really want to stress here that when we're dramatizing this, we have to go beyond any sense of what we see as personal loyalty, that she's just attached to Naomi, that she makes this decision. It's a bigger decision than that. It's as though in an instant, the issues come into razor sharp focus for Ruth. Despite Naomi's urgings, this choice is not about geography, family loyalty, or the future. This decision is about God. With startling determination, Ruth embraces Naomi, resolutely digs in her heels, and insists that the argument stop. Do not pressure me to desert you, to give up following you. This is no half-hearted decision, but a commitment to the grave. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. When you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. To squelch any further debate on the subject, Ruth goes over Naomi's head by appealing to Naomi's God, the God Naomi has just identified as the enemy, in a sense, to judge her, Ruth, severely if she fails to keep her word. Thus may Yahweh do to me and more, if even death itself separates me from you. Ruth accompanies this vow with a violent gesture, perhaps a slashing motion toward her throat, as if to say, may God do this to me if I break my vow to you. The impact on Naomi of these words is impossible to imagine. Could there be a stronger collision of words than Naomi's despairing, the Lord's hand has gone out against me, and Ruth's resolutely opposite, your God will be my God? What kind of logic is this? The explanation we usually settle on is that Ruth is so devoted and close to her mother-in-law that she simply cannot bear to leave her. Without a doubt, Ruth's loyal love for Naomi is one of the strongest themes that flow through this story, a love that in the end will prove more extraordinary and selfless than anyone could guess. But it's difficult to argue from this text for a chummy relationship between the two women. If we look at all the differences in her and all the hard times, it's not like she's sentimental about all the time they've spent together. The time they've spent together has all been difficult. Interaction between Naomi and Ruth following this exchange does not even hint of closeness between them. Instead, Naomi withdraws in a stony silence. When Naomi saw that she was firmly determined to go with her, she said nothing more to her. When they finally arrive in Bethlehem, Naomi laments with Ruth standing right beside her, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Empty is hardly what you'd expect to hear from a relieved mother-in-law safely back from the brink of nearly losing her precious Ruth. In silence, a bewildered Naomi collects her possessions and resumes the journey to Bethlehem with her unbending daughter-in-law at her side. This is the first time Ruth breaks the rules. It will not be the last. What possesses her to make such a choice? That's what we have to ask as playwrights. Why does she deliberately sabotage her own future? And I think the most obvious explanation from the point of view of the storyteller of the Book of Ruth is that somewhere along the road to Bethlehem, God closed in on Ruth. To the casual observer, Ruth is just embracing Naomi, but Ruth is also embracing Naomi's God. Scholars point out that this is the spot where Ruth the Moabitess chose to become an Israelite, a true follower of Yahweh, a conversion of faith expressed in a vow of radical self-sacrifice to Naomi. Although Ruth's actions clearly went against the grain of conventional wisdom and even her own natural instincts of self-interest, no doubt Ruth would concur with C.S. Lewis, who said it did not really seem possible to do the opposite when he was confronted with converting to Christianity. We can only guess what other factors may have contributed to this turning point in Ruth's life. Coming from the darkness of a pagan culture, she probably saw the differences when she entered a family of believing Israelites, heard their history, watched them interact with one another and with their neighbors, and observed them in the aftermath of 3 tragic deaths. They weren't perfect, but when you're living in darkness, as Ruth was, even a little light can make a powerful difference. Ruth may not have wrestled through the philosophical issues as rigorously as C.S. Lewis did. She did not see a vision of blazing light, like the one on the road to Damascus that turned Saul of Tarsus around, or a burning bush, like the one that caught Moses' attention, but she was as thoroughly reoriented as these men were. And she would impact her world as profoundly as they did theirs. To borrow from New Testament language, Ruth discovered Yahweh, quote, the pearl of greatest price, and she leaves everything behind to follow him. She might lose the world, but she has saved her soul. The road to Bethlehem marks a stupendous moment, the miraculous redirecting of a human heart that only God can cause. For her part, the young Moabitess never looks back. Okay, you can cut the recording.